The Association of Pittsburgh Priests presents Dr. Jeffery Sachs, PhD, speaking on Poverty Requires a Faith Response. The Social Development Goals of the United Nations and Pope Francis, Laudato Si.
I began with Sonia to go back to the Vatican as often as we can to meet with Pope Francis and to help the Church with a new message about the new challenges of our time. And those challenges, in Pope Francis's words, are the need for integral human and sustainable development. Integral human development means development of the whole person, so that every person in the world can live with dignity. And sustainable development means a very particular idea about our economic life. You know, in the news every day almost, will our economy grow 3% or 2.9% or 3.2%? Will the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to give a boost, and so forth? And all of that is about money and how much money we have. And the usual measurement is the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the measurement of all the production in an economy. And a lot of time is spent on how fast are we getting rich. In fact, I would say 99% of our attention is how fast is the economy growing? Is it growing fast? Is it growing slow? Is it growing unusually quickly? We hear about this all the time. But there's a big difference of how rich we're getting and how well we're doing.
What makes an economy moral?
As human beings, and how decently our economy is serving human needs. And there are at least two big dimensions to our economic life that aren't at all measured by how fast our economy is growing. One is fairness. Is our economy fair? You know, we have people like Mr. Bezos, Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon. A good product, by the way, I think, on the whole. At least I buy a book every day on Amazon. They're easy to carry on an iPad rather than a backpack full of books, as I used to carry all the time. But he's worth $140 billion by himself. And then there are people that are hungry and without health care, can't pay for their medicines, and our government says, well, there's no money for them. It's too bad. And we know a lot of people die in this country because they can't make ends meet. And Sonia, who's a medical doctor and a health specialist, works in very poor countries where children die by the millions each year because they're too poor for the most basic things needed to stay alive. So is that fair? I don't think so. And the Church's social teachings and Jesus in Matthew 25 made very clear that no, that's not why we're here. We're here to help the poor, what the Church calls the preferential option for the poor. That the first thing we do is make sure that everybody can meet their needs. But our economy doesn't function that way. Our economy is all about how rich, how much money, how much economic growth. And the second thing that our economy is completely haywire about is the environment, Earth, the creation. Because there's nothing, absolutely nothing in our economic system that makes businesses take care of the natural environment. Because you can pollute, you can destroy, you can overfish, you can do all sorts of things in the name of profit. And people are greedy, and businesses are irresponsible. They are what Pope John Paul II sometimes called structures of sin, because businesses not only sin, but they do it in a structural way. Their boards are, how much money are we going to make? What's our market cap? What are our quarterly profits going to be? How much are we going to get at the end of the year? Rather than are we doing things safely or dangerously for the planet? And I can tell you my experience as an economist is that lots of our most powerful companies are completely irresponsible, without a moral scruple. They just want to make money. And they don't even think about the ethics of what they're doing, whether they're polluting, whether they're causing dangers to the planet. So our economic system, our capitalist economic system, by itself does not produce fairness, nor does it produce environmental sustainability. And the idea of sustainable development, rather than the kind of economic system that we have, is that we should have a society that is prosperous, like we are on average, but also fair and also environmentally sustainable. Three things, not just one thing. So the idea is, let's not just try to get richer, but spend a moment to say, wait a minute, we actually are rich in this country. The average income per person, per man, woman, boy, and girl in this country is $62,000 per person each year. At that rate, nobody should be going hungry. Nobody should be going homeless. Nobody should be going without their medicines. We're a rich country, but we're completely unequal in income level. On average, it means a household of 4 people would have an average income of $240,000. So nobody should be suffering, but lots of people are suffering. And worldwide, the average income, depending on how you measure it, is something like $12,000 by one measure and $18,000 by another measure per person on the planet, and yet people are dying of poverty by the millions, the millions. So the idea of sustainable development is, could we get our moral scruples right to make sure that in this wealth that we have and the continued economic growth that we are having worldwide, that we care about the poor and that we care about nature, the creation, the other species, our own safety from climate change. We're really in a ridiculous position, unfortunately, with a ridiculous president, I'm sorry to say, who, no matter when the hurricane comes, or the floods come, or the heat waves come, or the forest fires come, he says, I don't believe it. It's sad. We have a president, honestly, who knows nothing about this, but also cares not at all. And I had a experience for 14 years of heading a scientific institute at Columbia University called the Earth Institute with hundreds of climate scientists, some of the world's leading experts. The man, for example, who was the person who put the words global warming into science for the first time in 1974, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, a great scientist. And another colleague who was NASA's chief scientist for 30 years. I can assure you the most brilliant people know it's true. that we're wrecking the planet, that we're causing great danger, that we're causing more storms, more heat waves, rising sea levels. And so it's not an issue, really, is it true or not? Of course it's true. It is interesting, how did we get a president that knows nothing? Because that's very alarming. We're a country filled with all sorts of smart people, but we have one of the worst people imaginable as president, unfortunately, because he's nasty and he's ignorant, and deliberately so, which is really something, how we have done this to ourselves.
Sachs, how does faith inform us about the economy?
Because this is a country filled with nice people and really smart people. So the idea of sustainable development is to make all of this fit together by being smart about how we use energy and how we manage the economy and how we regulate business. You know, our businesses, they say, we want to be deregulated. What does that really mean? It means we want to be able to wreck anything as long as we make money. Why is deregulation a good thing? It isn't. Not if the regulation is keeping you safe. Not if the regulation is preventing companies from putting poison into our nature or putting addictions into our population. So sustainable development says, take the holistic approach. Not just the, I need to be rich at any cost approach. So that's where Sonia and I began to go to the Vatican many times a year since 2011. I was representing the UN and meeting with the church leaders to talk about how integral, human, and sustainable development could become part of our global scene, and how the unique voice of Pope Francis and his moral authority and his wisdom could help to lead this effort. And it's very, very interesting. One of the Church's greatest treasures in the Vatican is the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and also the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. Have you ever heard of that? Sure. So this is an organization, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, that actually dates back to 1603, which is pretty young by church standards. And it was founded originally, it was called the Academy of the Lynxes, and the first president of it was none other than Galileo Galilei. And the idea was to bring the new science to the knowledge of the church. And the church has taught for 2 millennia the importance of combining fides et ratio, faith and reason, together. That science and faith should go together. In the church's teachings, there's no conflict of science and faith. Faith is part of the human spirit to know the universe, to know God, to know the creation. And it is an invitation to use rationality, to use science, to understand the world. And so with the church's idea, it's not, oh, we don't like science, we have faith. It is rather that faith and reason go together. And so the academy was set up in 1603, and then in its modern form, again in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, now called the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. And there is a chancellor of these 2 academies, a bishop named Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, who is a brilliant, brilliant, wonderful man. And he is a great scholar especially of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And so he's the most magnificent person to speak with because he has 2,300 years of wisdom to share as he leads these two academies. And he invited me and the United Nations into the deliberations of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences over the last 8 years to help the church to get a deeper understanding of the science of human-made climate change, the science of air pollution, the science of fighting poverty, and the idea of sustainable development. And what an incredible experience, life-affirming experience, because here is all of the church's grandeur. And I hope many of you have been to the Vatican. It's my favorite place on the planet. It's so beautiful. Standing at the what's called the Casina Pio Quattro, which is the home of Pius IV, who was a Renaissance Pope who knew how to live, by the way, like Renaissance popes did. So he built a beautiful summer villa, which at the time, still popes were not living in the Vatican. So it's a beautiful villa, and you stand there, and St. Peter's is right there, and Michelangelo is right in front of you, and the Vatican Museum is there. Oh, God. Anyway, anytime I can go, I just love standing there because you imbibe the beauty, the wisdom, the culture. Aristotle walks there because, remember, the churches and its teachings took in the great knowledge of the ancient Greeks, of Plato and Aristotle, and combined it with the teachings of Jesus.
Sachs, how can Laudato Si help us understand fairness?
To create this magnificent moral framework that we call Western civilization, but is good for civilization for the whole world, is an invitation for civilization for the whole world and a point of contact for the whole world. And when Pope Francis writes, he is always saying, this is not just for the believers, this is for communion with the whole world. This is for conversation and connection with the whole world. So that's how I come to you tonight, as part of this human adventure of the church in bringing its wisdom and its moral teachings to bear on global problems. And let me start with some of the words of, well, it's too late to start with some of the words, but let me say a few things about the words of, otherwise it would be an 8-hour lecture, so I hope you brought your tent and your sleeping bags. But Pope Francis issued the encyclical Laudato Si in 2015. Praised be, praise the Lord. And he says, interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Not America first, but humanity first. All human beings, human dignity everywhere. And because we're interdependent, to think about one world with a common plan. Yet the same ingenuity which has brought about enormous technological progress has so far proved incapable of finding effective ways of dealing with grave environmental and social problems worldwide. A global consensus is essential for confronting the deeper problems, which cannot be resolved by unilateral actions on the part of individual countries. Pope Francis is saying, not America first, not selfishness, not you're all cheating us, which is what our dyspeptic president believes. He doesn't know, he doesn't understand. He's dangerous, unfortunately, I have to tell you. really dangerous. And that's why we're traveling all over the world all the time, to say this is a common challenge. This is not something one country against another country. This is all of us together. That's why I went to China for 2 days, because with Chinese leaders there, I thought it was important, even though it's a lot of a schlep, as we would say, to go there and back in 2 days, that it is important to give the message that we're all in this together, that this trade war with China makes no sense, that the American people have really not been brought into this, that this is just a kind of nastiness coming from the White House, and that we really need to work together on these challenges. So one of the great moments of this was this day, September 25th, 2015. This is an amateur photo taken on this phone. Sonia and I were sitting right here at the UN General Assembly. You can see a man in white there, that's what that is, because Pope Francis opened up that session of the UN General Assembly in front of all the world leaders and told the world leaders that day, we need a common plan for our common home. It was very exciting, believe me, really quite remarkable. And at the end of the speech, the governments adopted 17 goals. They're called Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. They are goals to combine prosperity, social justice, and environmental sustainability, protection of the creation. So they are sustainable development, and they call on every government, including our own, to make more holistic policies and a common plan for our common home, so that the world economy and our national economies are not only prosperous, but fair and sustainable. What does fair mean? It means every child should have a chance for school. It means that every person should have health care. It means that everybody should have safe water and sanitation. Well, duh. But they don't. What does environmentally sustainable mean? It means we should be using solar power and wind power, not coal, oil, and gas, because those are dangerous, we found out. They were good for the beginning of economic development when we didn't know better, when we were small, economy worldwide, and when we didn't know how to use sunshine to produce electricity. But then the photoelectric effect was discovered, and Albert Einstein in 1905 figured out how it worked. That's what he won the Nobel Prize for. And then when the scientists and engineers put the rocket to the moon 50 years ago, they used solar panels. And then the Chinese built so many solar panels that the cost came down 99%. So now we have learned over the course of 125 years, instead of burning coal, we can use sunshine. Sunshine's clean and it doesn't hurt the planet, whereas coal is very polluting and it is causing the climate change. So this is what SDG 13 is about. And so forth. The idea is use our science, use our technology, so that we can be rich, fair, and sustainable at the same time. And the goals are sometimes called human rights. They're the same ideas as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted 71 years ago in 1948. It's sometimes called the moral charter of the United Nations. Remember, Eleanor Roosevelt gave the world the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all the world subscribed to it. And the Declaration of Human Rights says things like, everybody has the right to health. But we don't do it. They have the right to it, but they're too poor to get it. Because we're not tending to the poor. We're not tending to the hungry. We're not tending to the homeless, like Jesus said we must. And so we have the means to do it, but we haven't lived up to these human rights. And just one example. This is a map where the brighter colors show higher mortality of children. And you can see in Africa, it's a disaster. Because right now, about 5 million kids will die this year under the age of 5 of diseases like measles or malaria, which are 100% preventable or treatable. But they die because when they get a mosquito bite, it costs 80 cents, the malaria cure. But there's no health system because it's poverty. And it would be simple to change this. In fact, it was simple to change part of it. I recommended 20 years ago a special fund be created to help pay for malaria control. Well, they gave half of what I recommended, and malaria deaths have come down by half, even more. And I say, well, look, it works. And they say, oh, we're so broke. But we're not broke. We're greedy. We're silly.
Sachs, how are we indifferent to the globe?
It would be another 3 billion or so to end malaria. 3 billion a year. There are 1 billion people in the rich countries. If you add the United States, Germany, France, and all the rich countries, 1 billion people. So it's $3 from each of us once a year. And malaria would be eliminated. Better put, malaria deaths would be eliminated. There still would be malaria, but people wouldn't die of the disease, except maybe in tiny, tiny numbers. But we don't do it because we don't think. We don't care. There's a great phrase that Pope Francis introduced in Evangelii Gaudium, his first exhortation. He called it the globalization of indifference. This is very powerful. You go to someone and you say, malaria, hundreds of thousands of kids are dying, and they're, malaria, malaria death, stop, shush, I'm doing my solitaire. We have globalization of indifference. People are not paying attention. We have a president who every day says, we should cut all the foreign aid. What he means, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. But what he means when he says that is, we should be leaving kids to die. That's what he's saying. He's an ignoramus, I'm sorry to say it. No, but I really am sorry to say it. One shouldn't talk about ignoramuses that way. But we should not have them as presidents. That's what the sad part is. There's so many smart people in this country. So the problem is we need to get organized to do something about this. And we're just not doing it properly. But we could be doing it. And the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, you remember. You know, the hurricanes are becoming more deadly because as the warming takes place, the ocean water gets warmer, and that provides more energy for the hurricane. I have to check with my son, who studied this with the world expert on this at MIT, but the hurricane is like a heat engine. And the heat is provided by the warm water of the Caribbean. So as we have global warming, we have stronger, more intense hurricanes. And warmer air means more water vapor in the atmosphere. So the rainfall is worse. And warming means higher sea levels, so the flooding is worse. So more people are getting pummeled by this. And then we're not organized because we don't care. And Puerto Rico, we call it a territory, it's a colony. It's like we're the empire, and that's the colony. Somebody would say, we stole it fair and square in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. Remember, a boiler blew up in the USS Maine in the Havana harbor, and then all of the journalists said, go invade them, when it was probably an accidental explosion of the boiler. And that's when we took Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. The other two got away, but Puerto Rico remained our colony. And they don't have a representative in Congress that can vote. And so when a disaster comes, who cares? And the president went and he threw paper towels. A president of the United States. And you know what happened? We did very little, went away, power didn't come on for weeks. People on all sorts of medicines died because they couldn't keep the medicines, they didn't have the refrigeration, there wasn't transport, their ventilators, other things didn't work, hospitals broke down. So scientists went back to study what happened to the number of deaths. 2 studies were done.
Sachs, what would it cost to solve global poverty?
One study showed 5,000 extra deaths after the hurricane over a 6-month period. The other showed 3,000 extra deaths. Trump was asked about it. He said, I don't believe it. That was the end of the story, because nobody pays attention. Thousands of people died out of this kind of carelessness. And so that's what is happening to us unless we get our heads put on straight. And of course, there are more remote places we barely hear of, except maybe a moment in the news. But places that Sonia and I are visiting all the time that are being devastated by this. It's a little complicated to give all the numbers, but I did a calculation together with the International Monetary Fund of what it would cost to meet all of these goals. And without going into a lot of detail, the extra cost for 1.5 billion people in 59 countries, sorry, it was $500 billion. And then they figured maybe the countries, by better tax collections, could cover maybe 100 to 200 billion of that, so there was a gap that those poor countries need our help of about $300 billion a year. And it turns out that's a big amount for these poor countries, too much for them to pay, but since the world's so rich, it's about 0.5% of world output. So if the world devoted just 0.5% of the income, we could end extreme poverty, get every child in school, ensure health care for all the people in the poor countries. 0.5%, not tithing our income, not a tenth. 0.5%. But what do? We cut the aid. We don't increase the aid because we're indifferent to these realities.
What does the church teach us about our responsibility to the poor?
This is one of my favorite encyclicals of the Church's social teachings, a great encyclical called Populorum Progressio, the progress of the peoples. and it was by Pope Paul VI, who was a very, very brilliant pope and a brilliant theologian. And this was about how to help poor people back in 1967. And he quoted St. Ambrose, who I'm very excited because St. Ambrose was in Milan. We're going to Milan later this week. And we're going to see the great churches of Milan later this week. And St. Ambrose taught in Milan. And you know who he inspired? He inspired Augustine, the great church theologian. He was Augustine's teacher. And so Pope Paul VI wrote this. He said, everyone knows that the fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms, says Pope Paul VI. And then he quotes St. Ambrose. As St. Ambrose put it, you are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich. When you give to the poor, you're not giving to the poor, you're restituting what is due to the poor. Because the world belongs to everybody. This is my favorite social teaching as an economist. It's called the universal destination of goods. The purpose of all our technology, of all our resources, is for everybody, not for Mr. Bezos and Mr. Gates and Mr. Bloomberg and a few people. Bill Gates has been very good at making money, and he gives it away. But he needs to give it away more than he's giving it away. Because in 2010 he said, I'll give away at least half my wealth. He made a pledge. At that point he had $50 billion. He's given about $4 billion a year since then. Now he has $95 billion. Not bad, huh? Money makes money. Aristotle already pointed out 2,300 years ago, that is not morally legitimate, just money making money. And he was onto something. And St. Ambrose is really onto something, that we need to restitute to the poor what is theirs. This is how much countries give as a share of their income. Sweden's number one. It gives 1% of its income every year to the poor. Here's the United States. We give 18 cents out of every $100 to the poor. And by the way, it's going down because Mr. Trump, America first. Why are we wasting our money on dying children, after all? That's Mr. Trump, the nastiest president we've ever had, actually. But we're a stingy country. We're just a stingy country. But we're not stingy people. As a government, we're stingy because we're not being represented in our real values. We're not being told about what these choices really mean. We're not aware that a little bit could save millions of lives and a little bit less costs millions of lives. No one tells us this. Our leaders are irresponsible. And this is a big problem for us, and then we wonder why the world is unstable and unsafe. So the United States is also in our own crisis because we're not nice to the poor of the world and we're not nice to the poor of our own country. It goes together. We're cut taxes for the rich, cut taxes for the rich. Ronald Reagan started this in 1981. And our big mission in life is to make rich people richer. What kind of world is that? That's not the values that Pope Francis has talked about, and not the values that Jesus talked about, and not the values of the church's social teachings. So I brought along a few comparisons for you of how the U.S. stacks up to other rich countries, because we're the least fair of all rich countries now. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
Isn't that sad? It is really sad. So this is the poverty rate. Sorry for the acronyms. When you're an economist, you see them all the time. Czechoslovakia, Finland, Norway, France, Netherlands, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, Belgium, Austria, Poland, Luxembourg, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Israel, the US. Going from lowest poverty rate to highest poverty rate. Where is the US? The highest poverty rate of any high-income country because we don't share with the poor. Last week, Trump put out a new budget proposal. You know, of course, nobody paid attention because it isn't going to pass, but the values behind it are ghastly. The whole idea of the budget was to cut more of the little bit going to the poor. That was the point of it. It's unbelievable. It should have been a day of national reflection. Of course, it was hardly discussed. But we have the highest poverty rate. Look at where we are in life expectancy. The country with the longest life expectancy lives for 84 years on average. The United States, 78 years. We're 6 years behind the leaders now because our health system isn't operating properly. The medicines are out of sight. Purdue Pharma addicted a lot of this country to opioid addictions. Our food industry is poisoning us. And we don't do anything about it except deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. And do you know life expectancy in this country has gone down in the last 2 years? This technologically remarkable superpower, life expectancy is going down. Because we're not taking care of each other. We're not so fair to women. Big surprise. This is the share of the cabinet in different countries. In France, 50%. In Sweden, 50%. In Canada, 50%. In Slovenia, 50%. In the United States, 16%. 1 out of 6 in the cabinet. And this is a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. It's the statistic that economists use to measure how unequal the country is in income distribution. And it is a number that goes from 0 to 1. 0 means everybody's the same. 1 means that Mr. Bezos owns everything, and none of us have anything. Okay, so it's always a number between 0 and 1. And the low inequality countries, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Finland, Norway, they're at about 0.25, and the United States, the highest inequality of any rich country. Why? Because we cut taxes, we cut taxes, we cut taxes on the rich, on the corporations, and then slash the social spending. In these countries, you go to a hospital, you don't fill out any papers, no co-pays, no deductibles. No, are you in the network, out of the network? You're just in the country. And in fact, you don't even have to be a citizen. I had a stuck eyelash in Sweden a couple of years ago, and it was really an abrasion. And so they took me to the hospital and took it out. And then, well, how do I pay my insurance? No, it's free. Go. My mother, on the other hand, once was visiting a patient in a hospital. She spilled a little tea on her hand. And the nurse said, oh, Mrs. Sachs, you should go get a bandage on that. And she went to the emergency room and got ointment and a bandage. And then Blue Cross Blue Shield $600 bill afterwards. So this is the craziness of where we are. This unbelievable income inequality. And you look, by the way, at the nonprofit health provider, the CEO is probably making, well, if it's low paid, $2 million, high paid, $6 or $7 million of the not-for-profit. Unbelievable. People in the rest of the world cannot understand what's happening in this country. This is how much we're polluting, causing the global warming. It's the emissions of so-called greenhouse gases, the kind that trap the heat and make the planet warmer. Look at us. By the way, you can't see, there is one more country over here. It's Australia, because they mine a lot of coal. But we're next, and Canada's third. You know, they want to build the pipelines to sell their destructive products. Remember the Keystone Pipeline. They still want to build it, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Because these politicians are paid by the oil industry and by the coal companies, and because the coal companies and oil companies have so many lobbyists, they pay for the politicians, and then we wreck the planet, even though we have so much wind and solar and geothermal and hydroelectric power. We could do all of this without destroying the climate. And every day we're told we're overtaxed, we're overtaxed, we're overtaxed. But this is the tax rates as a share of our national income. You see, we're almost at the lowest end because we cut the taxes all the time for the rich. And then all the time, every day, the Wall Street Journal writes an editorial saying, oh, we're overtaxed. Oh, we don't want to be like those horrible countries like Denmark and Sweden. Those horrible countries that live longer than us, that have free health care, that don't have massive debt. Oh, and it's terrible. They don't have jobs. They all have 6 weeks vacation. It's just horrible. You know, in the summer, you can't find work. They're all on their sailboats. No, it's really a crisis. I've been to Sweden in July. Nobody works. It's a disaster. All they do is sit around in fancy restaurants and go on their sailboats. They can't find a job. We don't want to be like that. Horrible. All those high-tax countries, I issue a report with 2 other scholars each year. We just issued it last week, called the World Happiness Report, which reports on a survey that Gallup does in 150 countries, asking people, are you happy? And the way that it asks is an interesting question. Suppose that life is like a ladder, and the bottom rung of the ladder is the worst life you can imagine, and the top rung of the ladder is the best life you can imagine. The bottom rung is 0, and the top rung is 10. Where is your life? Where do you stand on the ladder of life? And hundreds of thousands of people give answers to that question around the world. And then we report on the findings of those surveys. And who comes out the happiest countries in the world? Finland, Denmark, Norway. Oh, all those countries breaking on their heavy taxes. See, according to the Wall Street Journal, they should be the most miserable places in the world. They're so miserable that they don't have to worry about tuition. They're so miserable they don't have to worry about co-payments. They're so miserable that they all have 6 weeks of vacation. They're so miserable that when a child is born, the mom has a paid 1-year leave and the dad has paid 9 months leave, no questions asked. They're so miserable that when the mom goes to work, there's quality child care for all. Oh, it's horrible there. It's horrible, I'm telling you. I've been there. Shocking. They don't even have cars. They walk around in their cities. I guess they can't afford buildings because it's so green. They have parks everywhere. They haven't developed them. And they don't know what to do, so they sit, they have coffee outside. Now, they're really messed up. We need to tell them how to work, how to have 3 jobs to make ends meet. They have 1 job, they don't have 3 jobs. They're lazy. So, anyway, go figure. But they say they're happy despite all of that. And we are 19th on the list and going down. And when I compared this year how we're doing, year by year, we're stepping down a lower rung of the ladder. Because we now have epidemics throughout this country. 40% obesity, massive opioid epidemics, lots of unhappy people. No one's helping. People are under stress in this country. They're really under a lot of stress. And our government's saying, be quiet. And our kids, well, this is interesting data. This is the number of hours on the screen. It's another addiction. And this is the number of hours of sleep. So we're also seeing what seems to be a rising depression among young people in the country as well. And I compared the estimates of the amount of mental illness in our country of various kinds with other countries in the burden of mental disorders around the world for 195 countries. The United States ranks 4th in mental disorders as per capita. For drug use, substance abuse, 2nd in the world now. Amphetamine 2nd, cocaine 1st, opioids 3rd, alcohol 39th, anxiety disorders 5th highest in the world, and depressive disorders 11th highest in the world. In other words, people are really under stress in our country. We stopped being nice to each other. We made a government system for the wealthy, by the wealthy, of the wealthy, and it isn't working. Let me end with why I believe we could have a common plan for a common home. And that is because I think all of these claims about, oh, the Chinese are out to get us, or the Mexicans are doing us in, or how evil Canada is, and that's a great invention of Donald Trump. Did you know Canada was really out to get us? Canada's never been out to get anyone. They don't even know what it would mean. But the idea that we could learn to live together is the most important idea. These are universal values. And we don't have to have a war with Iran. Sonia and I were in Iran a couple of years ago, warmly greeted, warmly welcomed, with so many colleagues to meet, talking about all of these issues. The common interests are so powerful that if we just chilled out a little bit and followed Pope Francis, we'd actually find a way to peace. Might not suit the military-industrial complex. It might not suit the world's hotheads. It might not suit Bibi Netanyahu, who is one of the most reckless people in the world, and coming to spread his recklessness in the last couple of days in the United States. Absolutely disgraceful, because Israel is not compromising. It's just trying to dominate, and that's really unfair too. So if we just shared, we'd find reception around the world. And I love President Kennedy, and I love the fact that in 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he said, my God, we need to do something a different way. We need to cooperate. Even with people who we think are our enemies, there's a common humanity. So we absolutely need to cooperate. And he went on a campaign to make peace with the Soviet Union. And in 1963, he negotiated with Nikita Khrushchev the partial nuclear test ban treaty to show that even in the Cold War, we could have an agreement with the other side. And it was a great campaign. And this is a picture of him giving the greatest speech of a modern American president, which was a speech about peace on June 10, 1963. And what he said in this speech was that peace depends on us, not just on the other side doing what we want, but on our own attitude. Because if we believe in peace and we believe in the humanity of the other, we will find humanity on the other side. And he gave this beautiful speech, and Nikita Khrushchev heard it, had it translated, and said, wow, that is a great speech. Called the US envoy in Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, I want to make peace with your president. That's the greatest speech by an American president since FDR. And they signed a treaty 6 weeks later, which shows what the human outreach can do to actually achieve something remarkable. And I'll just close with President Kennedy's words, because I believe that this is why we could fulfill Pope Francis's call for a common plan for our common home. So President Kennedy said in that speech, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.